Ethan Calloway loved the quiet charm of Maplewood Estates, a picturesque suburban neighborhood where he had lived for the past decade. Nestled among towering pines, his home was his sanctuary, especially in winter when he enjoyed the simple pleasure of a roaring fire in his living room. But one frosty morning, that tranquility shattered. Stepping outside to retrieve firewood, Ethan froze. His carefully stacked pile, every single log, had vanished overnight. At first, he questioned himself. Had he miscalculated how much he had left? Number just yesterday, he had spent an hour arranging it neatly, ensuring it was dry and ready for the season. Someone had taken it, and not just a few logs. His entire supply was gone. Fuming, Ethan stormed inside and pulled up his security camera footage. He half expected to see a desperate thief or maybe an animal, but what he found made his blood boil. There she was, Vivian Langley, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. With her ever-present smug expression, she had marched onto his property in broad daylight, directing two hired movers to haul away his wood into the back of a truck. No note, no explanation. She had simply taken it. Ethan clenched his fists. This time, Vivian had messed with the wrong person. Ethan stormed down the street, his boots crunching against the frosty pavement as he marched toward Vivian's house. He barely had to knock before the door swung open. There she stood, in her perfectly pressed cardigan, her signature pearl necklace resting on her collarbone, and that ever-present condescending smirk. "Oh, Ethan, what a surprise," she chirped, feigning innocence. "What brings you by?" Ethan crossed his arms. "You know exactly why I'm here, Vivian. My firewood, all of it, vanished overnight. And surprise, surprise, my cameras caught you stealing it." Vivian gasped, clutching her chest like he had just accused her of treason. "Stealing? Oh, Ethan, such a dramatic word. I simply repurposed it for the greater good." His jaw tightened. "The greater good?" She waved a manicured hand. "The HOA bonfire is coming up, and we were running low on firewood. Your pile was an eyesore, Ethan. It didn't fit the aesthetic standards of our beautiful neighborhood, so I took the liberty of removing it. Honestly, you should be thanking me." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "Thanking you? You mean I should thank you for stealing something I paid for and stacked in my own backyard?" Vivian sighed, already bored. "Oh, Ethan, it's just firewood. You can always get more." That was it. That was the moment he decided she wouldn't get away with this. Ethan took a step back, his anger cooling into something far more dangerous, calculated vengeance. He nodded, voice eerily calm. "All right, Vivian, you enjoy my firewood. But just know, you've made a huge mistake." Vivian scoffed, waving him off. "Honestly, Ethan, you always overreact." He turned on his heel, already forming a plan so devious, so perfectly poetic, he almost laughed. That night, Ethan worked with a quiet fury, hollowing out several logs from his garage. Inside each one, he carefully placed dozens of fire ants, tiny, aggressive creatures whose bites burned like embers. They were contained, waiting, ready. The next morning, Ethan stacked the logs neatly in his backyard, making sure they looked identical to the ones Vivian had stolen. It didn't take long. By afternoon, just as he sipped his coffee, he spotted her through the window. There she was, Vivian Langley, standing at the edge of his yard, hands on her hips, eyes locked onto his new pile of firewood. And just like before, she helped herself. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was wait. That evening, the HOA bonfire was in full swing. The entire neighborhood had gathered at the park, wrapped in scarves and coats, sipping hot cider and toasting marshmallows. At the center of it all, standing like a queen before her subjects, was Vivian Langley. She basked in the attention, microphone in hand, delivering one of her long-winded speeches about community values and the sacrifices she made to ensure the neighborhood thrived. Ethan, standing in the back, chuckled to himself. If only she knew what was about to happen. And now, Vivian declared, holding up one of Ethan's hollowed-out logs, I will personally add the first piece of firewood to this beautiful bonfire, as a symbol of unity. She dramatically tossed the log into the flames. The wood crackled and popped as the heat intensified. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. People clapped. The fire glowed warmly. Vivian smiled, basking in the applause. Then the ants woke up. A few tiny black specks emerged from the log, confused and frantic. Within seconds, dozens became hundreds, then thousands. It happened all at once. The ants, sensing danger, swarmed in every direction, crawling onto shoes, up pant legs, and over unsuspecting hands. The first scream came from a woman near the front, swatting at her jacket. Then another man yelped, shaking his hands violently, and then Vivian. She let out an ear-piercing shriek, stumbling backward as dozens of fire ants erupted from the burning log, crawling up her arms, her pristine sweater, and into her hair. Pandemonium. People leaped from their seats, knocking over cider cups and marshmallow sticks. A man tripped into the snack table, sending an entire bowl of caramel popcorn flying. Kids screamed. Someone fell into a folding chair, taking down 3 others with them. The scene was pure chaos, but no one had it worse than Vivian. She flailed, swatting at herself, her screams reaching opera-level intensity. In her panic, she knocked over a table, drenching herself in a massive pot of hot cider. Sticky and soaked, she spun in circles, arms flailing wildly, only making the ants angrier. Then, disaster struck. A plate of half-melted marshmallows had spilled onto her now cider-soaked sweater, turning her into a human sticky trap. The ants went wild. Vivian shrieked like a banshee, sprinting through the crowd in a blind panic. People jumped out of her way, some still swatting at their own clothes. In a final act of desperation, she ran full speed toward the lake at the edge of the park and dived in head first. A massive splash echoed in the stunned silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then someone chuckled. Another person snorted. Within moments, the entire neighborhood was howling with laughter. Vivian, drenched and humiliated, crawled out of the water. Her perfect image, ruined. And Ethan? He simply sipped his cider, watching the poetic justice unfold. Vivian Langley had spent years ruling the HOA with an iron fist, enforcing ridiculous rules and bullying anyone who dared to question her authority. But tonight, she was nothing more than a drenched, humiliated mess, dragging herself out of the freezing lake with soggy clothes, sticky marshmallow clinging to her hair, and her once pristine sweater covered in ant bites. The laughter from the crowd only made it worse. People weren't rushing to help her. They weren't gasping in shock or concern like they usually did when she demanded attention. No, they were laughing at her. Vivian's eyes darted through the crowd, searching for even one person who would come to her defense. But instead, she saw something far worse. Smirks, whispers, knowing glances. The spell she had cast over this neighborhood for years had finally broken. Ethan, standing near the back, sipped his cider with a slow, satisfied smile. He didn't have to say anything. The moment had spoken for itself. Vivian's face burned with embarrassment. Her entire reputation, her control, had gone up in flames just like that cursed log of firewood. With as much dignity as she could muster, she straightened her soaked cardigan, flipped her sticky hair over her shoulder, and stomped toward her car, leaving muddy footprints on the sidewalk. She didn't even attempt to give a speech or regain control of the situation. She just left, vanishing into the night. The moment her car disappeared down the street, a slow chuckle rippled through the crowd. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire gathering was in hysterics, replaying the disaster over and over again. "Did you see her face when the ants came out?" someone wheezed. "She dived into the lake like her life depended on it," another cackled. "I haven't laughed this hard in years," Barbara, the HOA vice president, admitted, wiping tears from her eyes. For the first time in ages, the neighborhood felt alive. People weren't whispering in fear about another one of Vivian's absurd rules. They weren't avoiding each other to keep from getting fined for minor infractions. They were bonding over the sheer, poetic justice of it all. Ethan didn't say a word. He just sat back, watching as the legend of Vivian's downfall spread like wildfire. The woman who once controlled everything had finally been put in her place. And the best part? She had done it to herself. As the night wore on, the fire crackled, the cider flowed, and the mood in the neighborhood felt lighter, like a weight had finally lifted. And Ethan? He simply enjoyed the victory, knowing that this was only the beginning of Vivian's downfall. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. The legendary Vivian versus the fire ants incident had spread like wildfire. Every time Ethan stepped outside, he overheard fragments of conversation. "Did you hear her scream? I thought someone was being murdered." "She looked like a rabid raccoon diving into that lake." "Honestly, it's the karma we've all been waiting for." But as much as the residents were entertained by Vivian's downfall, Ethan knew she wouldn't go down without a fight, and he was right. By noon, an urgent email blasted through the HOA mailing list. Subject: Emergency HO meeting, mandatory attendance. Vivian's usual dramatic wording filled the message, spewing about vandalism, gross misconduct, and a coordinated attack on the integrity of our community. It was clear she was desperate to flip the narrative and cast herself as the victim. Ethan smirked. "Nice try, Vivian." That evening, he arrived at the HOA community hall, which was packed. Normally, these meetings were miserable, filled with residents too afraid to question Vivian's absurd rules. But tonight, the energy was different. People whispered, chuckled, and exchanged knowing glances. At the front of the room, Vivian sat stiffly, her hair still frizzy from its unfortunate lake dive. Her face was tight with frustration, but she kept up the act. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, gripping the podium. "As many of you witnessed, last night's bonfire was turned into a complete disaster due to a deliberate act of vandalism. Someone tampered with the firewood, unleashing a dangerous infestation upon this community. This is a serious attack on our HOA, and I demand that the responsible party be held accountable." Silence. Vivian waited for the usual gasps of horror, the nods of agreement, the calls for justice. Instead, she got snickering. Someone from the back muttered, "Oh, please." Barbara, the HOA vice president, leaned forward. "Before we talk about vandalism, Vivian, let's talk about how that firewood got there in the first place." Vivian's eyes flickered. "Excuse me?" Barbara clasped her hands together. "If I recall, that was Ethan Calloway's firewood. Firewood you took from his backyard without permission." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vivian stiffened. "I was acting in the best interest of the community," she snapped. Old Mr. Dawson, a longtime resident, scoffed. "You mean you stole it? Sounds like karma to me." Laughter exploded through the room. Vivian's face turned scarlet. Ethan simply leaned back in his chair, watching the beginning of the end. Vivian's eyes darted across the room, searching for support. But for the first time in years, no one came to her defense. The residents of Maplewood Estates had lived under her rule for too long, enduring her ridiculous fines, arbitrary rules, and self-serving leadership. But now they were laughing at her. Vivian slammed her hand on the podium, her voice rising. "You don't understand. This was an attack on me. Someone deliberately placed insect-infested wood in the bonfire to humiliate me." Barbara, barely containing her amusement, raised an eyebrow. "And again, Vivian, where did the wood come from?" Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's irrelevant." Mr. Dawson let out a wheezing chuckle. "Not to me. You took his wood without asking, and it backfired on you. Poetic justice, I'd say." More laughter erupted. Vivian's control was slipping fast. She had spent years bullying these people into silence. But tonight, no one was afraid of her anymore. Ethan finally decided to speak. He leaned forward, his tone cool but firm. "Vivian, let's be honest here. If anyone else had taken property from another resident without permission, you would have slapped them with a fine so fast, their head would spin." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Ethan continued. "And if that same person had caused a massive public disaster, I bet you'd be calling for their removal from the HOA board." Vivian's face twisted. "You don't have the authority to—" Barbara stood up. "Actually, we do." Silence fell. Barbara folded her hands in front of her, eyes gleaming. "As HOA Vice President, I motion to hold a vote, right here, right now, to remove Vivian Langley from her position as HOA President, effective immediately." For a split second, no one moved. Then, as if a dam had broken, hands shot up across the room. Vivian's jaw dropped. More than half the room had voted in favor of her removal. She turned in desperation. "You need me! This community needs me! You don't understand how hard I've worked!" A voice from the back called out. "You fined me for leaving my porch light on past 10 p.m., Vivian. We'll manage." More laughter. Vivian let out a strangled sound, part frustration, part disbelief, before storming out of the community center. The moment the doors slammed shut, cheers erupted. The reign of Queen Vivian was over. Ethan leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Not only had he gotten his revenge, but he had freed the neighborhood from years of tyranny. That night, he sat on his porch, a fresh pile of legally owned firewood beside him, enjoying a peaceful fire at last. For the first time in a long time, Maplewood Estates truly felt like a community again. The night after Vivian's downfall, Maplewood Estates felt different, lighter, as if the entire neighborhood had exhaled a collective breath of relief. For too long, they had lived under her petty, self-serving rule, forced to abide by her ridiculous fines and power trips. But tonight, people laughed openly. Neighbors, who once barely spoke to each other out of fear of being reported for minor infractions, now stood outside in small groups, chatting, reminiscing about the legendary bonfire disaster. Ethan sat on his porch, sipping hot cider, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, true peace. He no longer had to look over his shoulder, worrying about some absurd HOA rule being used against him. He had stood up to Vivian in the best way possible, and now she was gone. Across the street, her house, once a beacon of control, was eerily silent. No more HOA notices taped to doors at dawn. No more emails about aesthetic violations. No more Queen Vivian. A few neighbors walked by, still chuckling about the chaos of the night before. "Did you see her face when the ants came out?" One man snickered. "I've never seen someone dive into a lake that fast in my life." Another laughed. Barbara, the HOA vice president, approached Ethan's porch, holding 2 steaming mugs of cider. She handed one to him, a knowing glint in her eye. "I don't suppose you had anything to do with those fire ants, did you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan smirked, taking a slow sip. "Me? I'm just a guy who enjoys a good bonfire." Barbara let out a hearty laugh and shook her head. "Well, however it happened, you did us all a favor. You gave people the courage to finally stand up to her. She thought she was untouchable." She gestured toward Vivian's darkened house. "But turns out, even queens fall." Ethan glanced at the freshly stacked pile of firewood beside him. This time, untouched. His firewood. He wouldn't have to worry about it being stolen ever again. Across the street, more neighbors gathered, toasting with mugs of cocoa and cider, their laughter echoing through the night. It wasn't just about Vivian being gone. It was about the community finding its voice again. "You know," Barbara mused, watching the cheerful scene, "I think this might be the first time people in this neighborhood have actually enjoyed a bonfire event." Ethan grinned, raising his mug. "Here's to a new era, one without HOA tyranny." Barbara clinked her mug against his. "And to firewood that actually belongs to you." The two laughed, the fire in Ethan's yard crackling warmly. For the first time in a long time, Maplewood Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a real community again. And as Ethan watched the flames dance in the night air, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, karma just needs a little push. As the days passed, the story of Vivian's downfall became legend in Maplewood Estates. People told it with grins, adding their own exaggerated details. How her scream shattered windows, how the ants formed a perfect line of attack, or how she ran so fast, she left flames behind her like a cartoon character. But beneath all the humor, there was a valuable lesson. Power unchecked will always crumble under its own weight. Vivian had spent years ruling over people with an iron fist, believing she was untouchable. She thought she could take whatever she wanted, bending the rules to suit herself while making everyone else suffer under her authority. But in the end, the very thing she used to control others, her arrogance, became her downfall. And Ethan? He didn't need to yell, fight, or beg for fairness. He simply let karma do its work, with a little push in the right direction. This story isn't just about a tyrannical HOA president getting what she deserved. It's about standing up to people who abuse their power, whether it's a boss, a landlord, or a person who thinks they're above the rules. When someone crosses the line, don't stay silent. You don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes, all you need is a little creativity. And most importantly, never let anyone make you feel powerless, because sooner or later, every Vivian gets what's coming to them. Ethan didn't just get his revenge. He changed the neighborhood for the better. And at the end of the day, that's the best kind of victory. So the next time someone tries to take advantage of you, just remember, karma is always watching.